Find out how the U.S. Army's Arctic research mission descended into cannibal madness, one of the most disturbing stories of polar endurance ever recorded. Chapter 1. A Mission of Glory. The summer of 1881 was laden with consequence, and the air above the crowded port of St. John's in Newfoundland was thick with the acrid bite of coal smoke, salty sea fog, and the almost tangible tension of powerful national pride. Crowds of onlookers, local officials, journalists, and ordinary citizens had gathered on the creaking wooden docks to witness at close quarters this monumental, historic moment as the massive black hull of the steam and sail whaling vessel Proteus was to finally cast off from shore, carrying 25 carefully selected daring men into the completely unknown, directly into the icy embrace of the brutal North. It was a time when the United States, still healing the deep wounds of the devastating Civil War, desperately desired to prove its dominance, power, and intellectual superiority on the international stage, and participation in the first International Polar Year seemed the perfect opportunity. Brass bands played loud patriotic marches whose sounds echoed from the steep hills surrounding the harbor, while hundreds of American flags snapped violently in the strong coastal wind, creating a colorful, almost hysterical spectacle of optimism. The atmosphere was saturated with unwavering faith in human progress, in the power of modern science, and in the belief that the American spirit was capable of taming even the most severe and inaccessible corners of our planet. The smell of tar, wet timber, and cheap tobacco mingled with the joyful cries of the crowd as the ship's powerful steam whistle bellowed a long, drawn-out blast, momentarily drowning out all of the commotion and signaling the final beginning of the great expedition that was to inscribe itself forever in the annals of the history of exploration. High on deck, towering above the noise and chaos of the harbor's farewells, stood Lieutenant Adolphus Greely, a man of an appearance hewn from the hardest granite, whose silhouette was the embodiment of military discipline and unwavering duty. Greely, a veteran of the brutal clashes of the Civil War and an officer of the Signal Corps, possessed a coldness and gravity that resonated perfectly with the icy challenge before him. His face, partly concealed behind a thick, dark beard and severe, round spectacles, betrayed not the slightest trace of emotion as his cool, analytical gaze fixed itself on the distant northern horizon. For him, this mission was not merely a joyous adventure or an opportunity to acquire cheap fame, but a sacred duty to his homeland and the supreme test of his command abilities. In his mind there was no room for doubt or weakness. He believed devoutly in regulations, in strict military hierarchy, and in the conviction that precise planning could overcome every caprice of nature, however destructive. He gripped the ship's wooden railing with such force that his knuckles whitened beneath the stretched skin, completely ignoring the cheering crowds on the quay. In his vision, stretching far beyond the horizon, he already saw the flag of the United States fluttering proudly at latitudes no other human had ever reached, and with every revolution of the Proteus's propeller, he drew closer to that longed-for glory that was to immortalize his name forever. Beneath the surface of this military bearing and patriotic exhilaration, however, the subtle yet dangerous seeds of conflict had already begun to germinate at the very outset of the voyage, embodied above all in the complicated relationship between Greely and the expedition's physician, Dr. Octave Pavy. Pavy, French by birth, was a man of an entirely different psychological constitution, a civilian scientist, an individualist of brilliant mind, but also of an extremely volatile temperament, who regarded the rigid military bureaucracy and absolute subordination with open contempt. His presence aboard, while absolutely critical to the crew's medical safety, from the very first days formed a grating contrast to Greely's autocratic management style. Pavey, pacing the deck with an elegant cane and a nonchalant expression, cast furtive, reserved glances in the direction of his commander, silently questioning his competence to lead in extreme conditions where the Army's regulations often lost any practical relevance. This smoldering animosity, visible in the dry exchanges during officers' meals and cool glances between them, was like an invisible crack in the expedition's foundations, a crack that in the warmth of its optimistic beginning seemed inconsequential, but that the Arctic frost would soon subject to the ultimate brutal test of endurance.
In sharp opposition to this hidden conflict of ego and power stood the figure of Edward Israel, a brilliantly gifted young astronomer from Michigan, whose delicate, almost boyish build contrasted starkly with the severity of his older companions and the brutality of the surrounding environment. Israel was the living embodiment of the pure, unsullied by political ambition spirit of science, and his eyes burned with feverish fascination every time he delicately polished the lenses of his precious instruments protected in their velvet cases. For him, the Proteus was not a warship or a tool of imperial dominance, but a magnificent floating laboratory, a vehicle that was to carry human intellect to the very edge of the universe. He pored for hours over star charts and complex logarithmic tables, completely absorbed in the mathematical beauty of the cosmos, ignoring both the creaking of the hull and the tense atmosphere prevailing among the officers. His enthusiasm was so infectious and his knowledge so vast that even the most seasoned soldiers watched his preparations with respect, seeing in this young, frail man the true heart of this mission, a mission that was to provide answers to the fundamental questions about the nature of the Earth's climate and magnetism.
The Proteus voyage through the treacherous icy waters of Baffin Bay was a true triumph of 19th-century engineering and seamanship, a brutal collision between a coal-powered machine and the might of the frozen ocean. The vessel, designed with an eye to collisions with pack ice, forced its way through dense ice fields with the deafening thunder of cracking ice that echoed through the cramped quarters below decks, reminiscent of constant artillery bombardment. The landscape beyond the railings changed drastically, transitioning from deep oceanic navy blue into a desaturated, almost monochromatic palette of white, gray, and frosty blue that resembled faded sepia photographs from the era. Enormous, majestic icebergs, illuminated by the uncanny flat light of the Arctic sun, passed the ship like silent, eerie cathedrals drifting through dark waters, evoking in the crew a mixture of deep awe and existential terror. With every kilometer traversed northward, the temperature dropped inexorably, and the ever-present, eye-stinging frost began to coat the heavy ropes and wooden elements of the rigging in a layer of sharp, gleaming rime, transforming the ship into an ice ghost, slowly stepping across the threshold of the realm of permanent winter.
In mid-August, after weeks of exhausting struggle with pressing ice and unpredictable currents, Lady Franklin Bay revealed itself to the exhausted yet excited crew. A stark, inhospitable but fascinating bay situated farther north than any previous American base. Discovery Harbor, as the place was named, was dominated by overwhelming steep cliffs of dark, fractured shale that dropped vertically to the frozen sea, forming a natural, threatening amphitheater. The Proteus anchoring in these waters was a moment of ultimate triumph. The ship's bell rang out a joyful rhythm, and the weary men rushed onto the icy deck to absorb with open mouths the boundless, inhuman landscape. They felt like true pioneers stepping on the surface of an alien planet, proud that they had conquered nature and arrived where others had met with failure. This moment, saturated with absolute euphoria and a sense of historical weight, inscribed itself forever in their memories, masking for that brief, fleeting instant the fact that they had just placed themselves in one of the most lethal and merciless locations on the face of the earth, thousands of miles from any assistance.
Immediately after anchoring began the murderous, unceasing process of unloading thousands of tons of provisions, equipment, and building materials, which demanded superhuman effort and iron military coordination. The men, working almost without pause in the light of the non-setting Arctic sun, carried to the cold, graveled shore enormous quantities of coal, barrels of salted pork, heavy crates of scientific instruments, and precisely cut boards from which their new home was to be fashioned. The labor was extraordinarily exhausting. Sweat froze on their faces and seeped into their thick woolen clothing, and their hands became covered in painful blisters and frostbite from handling raw timber and ice-cold metal. The blackness of coal dust settled on the unblemished white snow and their tired faces, creating a striking, almost surrealistic contrast between the grime of human industry and the crystalline purity of Arctic nature. Greely, his ever-present notebook in hand, conducted this chaos with ruthless precision, ensuring that every ounce of provisions was carefully inventoried and secured before the harsh winter's arrival.
With lightning speed, driven by military discipline and the desperate need for shelter, the structure of Fort Conger began to rise on the barren shore, an engineering wonder of its time and a symbol of American determination. It was a spacious, solid wooden building, doubly insulated and lined with thick layers of tarred paper, designed to withstand the worst onslaughts of polar gales and extreme temperature drops. The sound of striking hammers, the screech of saws, and loud commands echoed with a dull resonance from the high cliffs, constituting the first brutal, intrusive noise of civilization in this eternal, unspoiled silence. The men worked with great fervor, watching how with every driven nail their fortress grew, a safe haven that was to protect them from the darkness and ice. When the solid wooden door was finally hung and the first fire lit in the large cast-iron stove, the sense of safety and comfort that washed over the exhausted crew was almost euphoric.
The interior of Fort Conger quickly transformed into a cozy, if slightly claustrophobic, enclave of 19th-century civilization, contrasting sharply with the boundless void raging just beyond the thin wooden walls. The long main room, brightly illuminated by kerosene lamps, was cleverly divided into a sleeping area with neatly arranged bunks, a dining space, and, most importantly, a spacious scientific sanctuary where the most delicate instruments were set up with reverential care. The air inside was thick and stifling, saturated with the strong smell of burning coal, damp wool from drying clothes, strong black coffee, and aromatic pipe tobacco that the men smoked in moments of relaxation. They had created the illusion of a home hearth, a small America in the heart of the ice, where in the evenings books were read aloud from a well-stocked library, cards were played, and optimistic plans made for the coming months, with the conviction that this wooden bastion was a completely impregnable fortress. Just a few days after construction was complete, the scientific mission that constituted the principal purpose of their presence in this frozen hell was running at full capacity, transforming Fort Conger into a hive of meticulous, methodical activity. Edward Israel, assisted by designated soldiers, installed anemometers on the roof with surgical precision, constructed special meteorological shelters for delicate thermometers, and hacked a deep hole through the thick ice of the bay to place there a complex tide gauge recording the sea's tidal movements. The daily routine became completely subject to a strict data collection regimen, with the men required, regardless of raging blizzards or paralyzing cold, every few hours, with accuracy to the minute, to read and carefully record in thick ledgers dozens of environmental parameters. This painstaking, pedantic labor, though often tedious and physically painful due to the cold penetrating through their gloves,
gave deep meaning to their existence, building in them an unshakable conviction that every entry begun in the journal brought humanity closer to unraveling the deepest mysteries of the global climate.
Encouraged by the initial scientific successes and the relatively mild late summer weather, the expedition members began organizing short exploratory excursions into the unknown interior, enthusiastically discovering the secrets of Ellesmere Island. They found the blackened, forgotten remains of an old campsite from Captain Nares's British expedition, which filled them with a thrill of excitement and a sense of historical continuity. And they also encountered a surprisingly rich local fauna. Herds of powerful, shaggy musk oxen, lightning-fast Arctic hares, and snow geese formed not only a fascinating subject of biological study, but also an extremely valuable supplement to their diet with fresh, nourishing meat. These first successful hunts and free exploration reinforced their false, ruinous sense of security. They began to believe that the Arctic, though harsh, was a place that could be easily tamed and understood with proper preparation and discipline.
The day arrived, however, that had inevitably had to arrive, the day of farewell, on which the whaler Proteus, fearing the early arrival of pack ice threatening to crush the hull, was obliged to leave the bay and set off on the long journey back south. When the powerful steam whistle uttered its final mournful sound and the thick mooring rope splashed down into the icy water, 25 men stood in a row on the gravel shore, watching in silence as the ship slowly receded toward the horizon. As the black hull grew smaller until it became merely a dark point against the backdrop of white icebergs, and the plume of coal smoke dissolved into the gray sky, an absolute, crushing, almost physically palpable silence fell upon the shore. In that one dramatic moment, they fully understood for the first time that the only umbilical cord connecting them to the living world, to civilization, to their families and the warmth of their homes had just been brutally and irreversibly severed, leaving them entirely at their own resources. Gazing into the empty, vast horizon, Greely and his crew remained alone on the threshold of the most dangerous adventure of their lives, facing the approach of the relentless winter that would soon envelop their world in permanent darkness. Despite the overwhelming isolation, their hearts were still filled with a naive, unwavering certainty that everything would proceed according to the brilliant military plan, and that the relief ship, loaded with fresh supplies and letters from home, would, without fail, appear in these same waters exactly 1 year hence. They could not predict, however, that the icy sepia-tone landscapes they were now so proudly photographing with their massive cameras would soon become the merciless arena of a murderous struggle for survival, testing their humanity, loyalty, and senses to absolute, unimaginable limits. This heroic, proud photograph of 25 determined pioneers standing before their wooden fortress against the backdrop of boundless ice would forever remain a visual, haunting testament to their great ambitions, frozen in time for a fraction of a second before the Arctic darkness began slowly yet inexorably to consume them.
Chapter 3: Retreat into a Frozen Hell.
During the second winter at Fort Conger, the Arctic darkness was no longer merely an astronomical phenomenon or a simple absence of sunlight, but had become a tangible, choking entity that had crept into every crack of their wooden shelter and nested like a parasite in the very minds of the 25 people imprisoned there. The sinister cold, merciless and penetrating to the marrow of their bones, intensified with every passing week, transforming the moisture from their breath into thick, sparkling layers of frost on the walls in the weak, flickering light of the whale oil lamps, making the interior of the research station resemble a glacial tomb in which they were being buried alive. The food rations, once a source of reassurance and the very foundation of the expedition's strength, had now been drastically and inexorably cut, and the specter of true hunger, initially merely an abstract threat discussed during officers' briefings, had become a brutal physical daily reality that had sharpened the features of their faces and kindled in their sunken eyes a feverish, desperate gleam, resembling the gaze of cornered animals. The men's bodies, exhausted after 18 months of extreme exertion in inhuman conditions and chronic vitamin deficiencies, began to betray the first terrifying symptoms of scurvy. Their pale gums bled without cease, their teeth wobbled in their sockets at the slightest pressure, and their skin, dry as old parchment, became covered with blue, painful bruises, resembling maps of their own inevitable biological decay. The original elevated brotherhood and sense of great scientific mission that had bound the detachment into an iron fist during the first steadfastly hopeful year had now completely evaporated, giving way to mounting paranoia, morbid suspiciousness, and a quiet, venomous animosity, where every miserable crumb of hardtack was watched by companions with a mixture of concealed jealousy and growing hatred. When at last the brief Arctic summer of 1883 arrived after months of indescribable psychological and physical degradation, it brought not the longed-for deliverance, but only pale, cold sunlight that mercilessly exposed the tragedy of their hopeless situation, illuminating their ruined bodies and ravaged faces. Day after day, weakening, staggering men forced themselves to make grueling treks to the nearby heights above Lady Franklin Bay, from where, through the lens of brass telescopes cracked by the bitter frost, they stared at the empty, treacherously gleaming horizon of Kennedy Channel, searching for even the smallest outline of a black mast or plume of coal smoke that would herald the arrival of the longed-for relief ship. Yet the ocean remained mockingly, terrifyingly empty.
The initial phase of their dramatic, hope-filled retreat quickly transformed into an absolute, bone-crushing physical nightmare that exceeded all human imagination of extreme endurance, demanding from the starving, ailing men an effort at the very boundary of the organism's biological capabilities. Forced to drag heavy oak boats and massive sledges across endless, chaotic fields of frozen pack ice, they had reduced themselves to the role of pitiable draft animals, harnessed in thick hemp ropes that with every agonizing step dug into their skeletal shoulders, wearing through their thin, dirty jackets and scraping skin to raw, bleeding flesh. The ice stretching around them was not a smooth, easily traversable surface, but a distorted, jagged landscape of gigantic blue pressure ridges, crevices dozens of meters deep, and shards protruding like ice knives that maliciously snagged the heavy sledge runners and tore apart their worn leather boots, exposing their frostbitten, festering feet to direct contact with the frozen ground. Every meter of their wretched progress required superhuman, brutally coordinated effort by the entire detachment, men screaming from unimaginable pain, falling with a dull crash face down onto ice hard as granite with mechanical regularity, unable to raise their hands even instinctively to cushion the impact, injuring their cheekbones and smashing their bloody noses against the ice, only to rise a moment later with dull animal stubbornness, driven solely by the deep, biological survival instinct that somehow still refused final capitulation. The cruel polar wind did not relent for even one merciful moment, slicing their strained faces with particles of frozen snow sharp as broken glass, freezing sweat on their trembling bodies and turning their wretched clothing into rigid, icy armor that with every step painfully impeded the smallest movement. As though the icy sea itself had decided to maliciously test the ultimate, impossible-to-cross limits of their physical endurance, At the end of August, a powerful Arctic storm suddenly erupted, striking their defenseless tiny flotilla in a rare open basin with all the fury of an element awakened from deep sleep. The low sky above their heads darkened within minutes to the color of bruised cold iron, and the howl of the Arctic wind rapidly transformed into a deafening roar of a frequency that struck the eardrums, drowning out human cries and seeming to tear apart the very fabric of the freezing air, snatching from the surface of the black ocean enormous columns of water vapor that cut their ravaged faces more sharply than a desert sandstorm. Waves, rising suddenly like mountains and black as polished onyx, began brutally tossing their tiny open boats like helpless corks on the agitated surge, carrying them at terrifying speed up steep crests and then mercilessly hurling them into deep, dark valleys, each of which seemed to be a final invitation to their watery tomb. Yet the most absolutely terrible aspect of this apocalyptic tempest was what happened in the fraction of a second after the gigantic waves crashed against the wooden sides, the icy salt water bursting in with full force in confrontation with the extreme negative temperature of the powerful wind, immediately crystallized, coating the boats, the precious ropes, the canvas baggage, and the huddled men themselves in thick, rapidly growing layers of heavy ice. A desperate, frenzied struggle to remain afloat commenced as the terrified, frozen-to-the-bone men fell upon the ice, coating the gunwales with everything that came to hand: small axes, blunt hunting knives, and not infrequently their own bloody bare fists, knowing perfectly well that even the smallest additional weight of ice on the bow would inevitably drag the overloaded boat to the ocean floor.
Their endless march and southward voyage, interrupted only by blizzards and conducted with an irrational stubbornness worthy only of condemned men at the scaffold, had with time become a cruel blurring of the boundary between painful waking reality and a waking nightmare, in which days and nights merging together had transformed into a single unbroken succession of escalating physical pain and a madness progressing with each day, destroying the remnants of their minds as effectively as the ever-present hunger destroyed their weakening bodies. Extreme, life-threatening exhaustion, severe dehydration combined with chronic sleep deprivation, and the glaring brilliance of sunlight reflected from ice began systematically producing powerful, terrifyingly realistic hallucinations that tortured their half-dead senses. Some heard in the howling of the wind the tender voices of their weeping wives and mothers. Others swore they heard church bells from their distant green home-town villages, and in the shapes of icebergs drifting through the fog, many discerned the sharpened outlines of powerful rescue ships or richly laden steaming banquet tables. These mirages vanished the moment they attempted to reach them with a smile on their faces, bringing them each time to bitter tears of infinite desperation and fits of hysterical sobbing. And then, in the most unexpected moment, when almost all rational hope had completely evaporated from their dried-out, resigned hearts and exhausted minds, against the monotonous, blindingly white horizon of inhospitable Ellesmere Land, their blurred sight caught an unnatural, regular shape. A stone cairn erected by human hands, unmistakably marking a place where supplies had been cached by one of the previous polar expeditions. At this sight, a powerful, electrifying shudder of pure emotion rolled through the emaciated, stumbling in agony detachment, and the exhausted, half-dead bodies that a moment before had barely been dragging their feet suddenly and inexplicably found within themselves incredible hidden reserves of energy.
Chapter 4. Camp Clay, przylądek glodowy.
The leaden, heavy sky closed over the 25 exhausted men like the massive lid of an ice coffin, finally sealing their fate on the merciless, wind-scourged strip of land known as Cape Sabine. The hope of reaching their intended destination, of escaping the inexorably approaching winter, died at the moment the ocean around them began to freeze, transforming into an impassable, jagged barrier of mutually crushing ice. Halted halfway, starving, and at the absolute limit of their physical endurance, they understood with terrifying clarity that from this place there was no longer any escape. The landscape surrounding them was the essence of absolute, hostile wilderness. This was not merely nature, but an active, malicious force bent on their annihilation. Bare, black rocks protruded from the snow like the broken bones of a prehistoric monster, and the wind howled with such force that it drowned out human thoughts, carrying with it particles of ice that cut their faces to the bone. It was here, on this accursed, barren spit of land, that Greely and his men were forced to make a desperate attempt to build a winter camp, a place that would soon acquire the macabre name, Starvation Camp. With every step, with every breath in the freezing air, their magnificent, heroic, scientific expedition was stripped of the last remnants of its former glory, transforming into a primitive, brutal struggle to survive another day. The understanding that they would not reach safe haven settled upon them with a weight as crushing as the mounting frost, and the awareness of the shortage of supplies amplified the growing panic that each of them tried to conceal behind a mask of soldierly discipline.
Physical degeneration advanced in ghastly duet with the slow yet equally inevitable breakdown of their psyches, as the passage of time lost all meaning for them. Days merged with nights into one long, endless succession of darkness and suffering, and the only anchorage for their fleeing minds were the expedition journals, maintained with fanatical stubbornness by Greely and several other officers. Recording dates, temperatures, and food rations constituted a desperate attempt to maintain control over a reality that had completely escaped all control, an attempt to impose human order on the merciless chaos of nature. In the silence of the Arctic night, broken only by the howl of the wind and the crack of fracturing ice, their minds began playing ever crueler tricks on them. Memories of former life, green fields, the faces of loved ones, the taste of home-cooked food that had at first brought comfort became with time instruments of torture, underscoring the contrast between the lost paradise and the hell they found themselves in. The constant sound of groaning, coughing, and the raving of delirious companions filled the space of the tent, making any psychological rest completely impossible. They were imprisoned not only in the physical trap of ice and stone, but also in the dark cages of their own gradually collapsing minds, where hope was slowly replaced by the apathetic waiting for the inevitable end. In the darkness of Camp Clay, hallucinations became an inseparable, terrifying element of their daily existence, offering a false escape that always ended in an even deeper submersion in despair. One of the soldiers, whose organism was on the verge of complete exhaustion, began speaking into empty space, staring with unseeing eyes at the ice-covered canvas ceiling in which he saw the warm, joyful interior of his family home. Death, which for months had circled their encampment like a starving predator, finally crossed the threshold of Camp Clay in a manner painfully quiet and devoid of any drama. The first man to succumb to exhaustion did not depart in the heat of battle, nor with a last heroic word on his lips. His passing was merely a barely perceptible cessation of breathing, a quiet extinction of the still smoldering ember of life.
Chapter 5. Egzekucja szeregowca Henry'ego.
In the deepest, darkest abysses of suffering at Cape Sabine, in the place that history would forever remember as Camp Clay, commonly and ominously called Starvation Point, the last fragile remnants of military discipline and elementary human decency were subjected to the ultimate brutal test. The winter of 1884 was not simply a season, it was a cosmic, indifferent force that crushed bodies and minds with merciless mechanical precision, slowly sucking from the imprisoned men every last vestige of hope for rescue. The wind howled without pause, striking the thin ice-covered canvas of the tent with hurricane force, and the temperature dropped to levels at which the human breath froze in the air, falling on their starving, trembling bodies in the form of fine, sharp rime. The darkness of the polar night was absolute and crushing, seemed to possess a physical density that suffocated and intensified the hallucinations induced by extreme malnutrition. The men, reduced to the state of walking skeletons sheathed only in parchment-like bluish skin, spent their days and nights in cramped squalor, lying in damp, rotting reindeer skin sleeping bags whose fur had long since begun to fall away, and the smell of unwashed bodies and advancing scurvy hung in the stifling air like the stench of an open tomb. Food had ceased to be merely a means of satisfying hunger and had become an absolute holiness, a religion around which their most feverish thoughts revolved, a desire so powerful it drove out all memories of homes, families, and former lives. In this very demented context arose the problem that was to tear their remnant community to shreds. Suspicion began to creep through the tent like a venomous serpent, poisoning the minds of men who until now, despite everything, had treated one another as brothers bound by the ties of a shared nightmare. When specific portions began to go missing and clear traces of a knife cutting thin, clandestine strips from the reserve sealskin were noticed, paranoia erupted with full destructive force.
Chapter 6. The Ultimate Taboo.
Private Henry's body had lain in the snow for 3 days, resembling more a macabre sculpture hewn in the merciless ice than a man with whom they had so recently shared the remnants of their meager rations. And the frost had struck with such force that it had halted all processes of decomposition, preserving his remains in a ghastly state of perfect, terrifying intactness. His face, turned toward the leaden, indifferent sky, had frozen in an expression of almost blissful calm that contrasted brutally with the agonies endured by the surviving, desperate members of the expedition. The wind howled between the ruined tents, carrying particles of ice sharp as razors that settled on his dead eyelashes and brows, forming on them a sparkling, pearlescent rime gleaming in the weak light of the Arctic sun. The surviving men, reduced to walking skeletons covered only in parchment-like bluish skin, could not tear their gaze from this motionless, terrifying sight. Initially, they looked at him with deep grief, reciting silent prayers for his departed soul, but with every passing hour, with every painful, gut-wrenching spasm of their empty stomachs, the nature of their gaze began to undergo a terrifying, subcutaneous transformation. Hunger in this camp was no longer merely an absence of food. It had become an autonomous predatory being, a monstrous parasite, devouring them from within, consuming their last reserves of muscle, their vanishing tissues, and finally the very foundations of their humanity. Sitting in the icy half-darkness of their wretched, snow-drifted shelters, they looked at the dead Henry, and in the dark recesses of their minds they saw no longer a deceased friend, no longer a comrade in arms with whom they had shared the hardships of the journey, but the only available source of potential survival in this white, sterile desert, a macabre reservoir of protein and fat. These most primal biological imperatives began to brutally assume control over their fading minds, mercilessly drowning out the remnants of their civilized conscience, while their own stomachs convulsed in painful, endless spasms, reminding them of the inexorably approaching death unless they soon took the most drastic, unimaginable, and accursed steps that the history of desperation has ever known.
Chapter 7. Rescue and Revelation. Commander Winfield Scott Schley stood like a solitary, frozen sentinel upon the freezing, frost-coated deck of the rescue ship Thetis, his bloodshot, weather-beaten eyes scanning the impenetrable, jagged horizon of the Arctic Sea, a nightmare landscape that seemed to have been violently forged in the very depths of a frozen, unforgiving hell. The year was 1884, and the month of June, which in more temperate southern climes brought the gentle, life-affirming warmth of early summer, offered absolutely no solace here at the top of the world. Instead, it delivered only a desolate, biting wind that sliced ruthlessly through heavy, layered woolen coats and chilled the very marrow of the anxious, exhausted men aboard. The desperate, high-stakes expedition to save First Lieutenant Adolphus Greely and the 24 doomed men of the Lady Franklin Bay expedition had long ago devolved into an agonizing, seemingly futile race against the ruthless, unfeeling clock of nature, a clock that had undoubtedly already run out for many, if not all, of the lost and starving explorers who had been abandoned to the ice. The haunting historical wet plate photography of their collective minds captured this terrifying moment in stark, desaturated tones of cold, piercing blue and oppressive heavy sepia. The extreme high contrast between the blinding, fractured ice floes and the deep, abyssal shadows of the open, freezing water, perfectly reflecting the binary nature of their grim mission: absolute life or absolute death. The heavy film grain of physical exhaustion, chronic sleep deprivation, and mounting psychological anxiety overlaid every terse, whispered interaction among the beleaguered crew, painting a raw, unfiltered portrait of men pushed to their absolute limits by the harshness of the environment. Schley felt the crushing, monumental weight of history bearing down upon his tired, aching shoulders. Previous well-funded attempts to reach the isolated man at Lady Franklin Bay had ended in disastrous, humiliating failures, leaving the relief ship Proteus utterly crushed and swallowed by the merciless icy sea, and the Yantic retreating south in shame, cowardice, and defeat. Now the Bear and the Thetis pushed relentlessly northward, their massive coal-fired steam engines groaning and shuddering in a desperate mechanical symphony against the grinding, shrieking protests of the impenetrable pack ice that threatened to entomb them at any moment. The sky above was a bruised, metallic dome of unbroken, suffocating gray, devoid of even a single, solitary ray of sunlight, pressing down upon the tiny, fragile wooden vessels with a suffocating, somber bleakness that seemed designed by some malevolent deity to extinguish all human hope. Every man on deck, from the lowliest freezing deckhand to the most seasoned, battle-hardened officers, knew with a grim, unspoken certainty that with each passing, agonizing hour, the probability of finding the man of the expedition alive dwindled to a terrifyingly infinitesimal fraction. They were navigating through a vast, silent graveyard, a monumental, uncaring tomb of ancient frost and shattered, towering glaciers, where the profound, absolute silence of the Arctic was only broken by the violent, percussive collision of ship timbers against ancient, unyielding ice. The raw, fragile human element of hope fought a continuously losing battle against the sheer, unfeeling vastness of the polar extremity, a landscape that cared absolutely nothing for human suffering, bravery, or ultimate sacrifice. Schley gripped the icy wooden railing until his knuckles turned a deathly translucent white, his racing, troubled mind haunted by the spectral ghosts of the men they were desperately seeking. Men who had been effectively abandoned by the bureaucratic delays of their own country to face a slow, agonizing, and freezing demise at the very edge of the known world. He ordered the ship's engines to be pushed even harder, risking